Welcome to Jazz Perspectives. My name is Kurt Wilson, Director of Jazz Studies at Texas Christian University. I recently had the opportunity to sit down and talk with Linwood Curly Broyles, who is a trumpet player and band leader, left his musical mark, certainly in Fort Worth, but also across the country, as a soloist with the great Ray McKinley Orchestra.
I think I played my first professional job as a 14-year-old. My first New Year's Eve date is a 15-year-old, and this was 1937, Curtis, and we were on 60-40 commission. No guaranteed, and I didn't care whether we got paid or not, but it was in a little town called Grenada, Texas. So we go down there, and there were just all kind of people there. So when they paid us off, we all made $37 apiece. Now you cannot imagine how much money $37 was in 1937.
A lot of money.
I took it home to my mother, and the next morning I gave her $2 of it. She said, "Oh, did you make $2?" Oh, I said, "Yeah," and I think this is. I handed her 5, then I handed her the 10. And when I handed her the 20, she was convinced that I'd been out stealing hubcaps. She was just sure that
That was a lot of money in the
it was. And then she knew then there must be something in the music business. She started me on piano when I was in kindergarten, bought me my first saxophone, brand new Martin B-flat straight soprano when I was in the 2nd grade. And I played that for a number of years. One of the bands that I played with, Rudy Gleisner and the Seven Aces, we worked out of Victoria, Texas. I had to play 3rd alto and lead trumpet. Now, yeah. and I would borrow this friend of mine, alto, and it was like a juggling act trying to keep those horns going like that. But it was fun. And what I failed to mention about this $37, a year or so later, we got booked again down there for a regular job, and they took it on 60-40 again. So Rudy, who was the leader, says, "Well, I hope this is a repeat of New Year's Eve." I says, "I doubt that it will." And it was in the mid of winter. And going down, he had this 34 Ford and no heat in it. We were about to freeze to death. And we got there and nobody there. We made 40 cents apiece. So we left early to come back, and I said, "Let's stop at the Aztec Cafe here in Victoria." We pull in there, and I put my 40 cents down on the counter, and I told the waitress. She says, "Well, what's that for?" And I says, "Keep bringing me your chili till I've eaten all of that up."
Till I've had my 40 cents worth.
Yeah, but I didn't care. I was 15 years old, and I was playing, which I just, what I wanted to do.
When you first came to Fort Worth from Goliad, Texas.
Oh, yeah. Well, that was a great day for Curly Broyles. It was the summer of 40, Curtis. My band director, N.J. Whitehurst, brought me up for an audition for a scholarship at TCU. And came up. Don Gillis was the director of the band then, and became my closest friend, and a wonderful man, by the way. And he gave me my test for my scholarship, and I had to do a little reading, a little jazz, and a lot of conversation. But after a little while, he says, "Well, I'm going to give you a scholarship." And fortunately, it was one, everything paid for, including books. And believe me, I needed it, or no other way that I could have come to TCU. And so I went back to Goliad and did a little chore around town, earning some money so I could bring with me to Fort Worth. But I came up that school year and stayed 4 years and had an awful lot of fun at a great institution.
In the late 1930s, the TCU marching band was actually known more for their jazz playing than their marching ability.
Really, the band, and I guess Don Gillis should be given the credit for it, At that time, we weren't considered what you call the normal good marching band, but they had a terrific reputation for being able to play jazz, which was unusual for a college band at that time. And I think that they saw that they had the nucleus within the marching band of guys that played in orchestras to make good jazz players. And the library and the music that we played was written around those type of players. How I became known about it, we had a young minister by the name of Dick Claiborne that was doing graduate studies at Bright College of Bible at TCU, and he would travel 300 miles down to Goliad to preach old Sundays. And
My goodness.
And he was
Long commute.
Yes, it was. And then he had to ride the train back. And Miss Ollie Brown, who played organ in the church, let him spend the night there, and then my mother would fix his meals and put him on the train and send him back. He was the first person to tell me about TCU, and he knew I was involved in jazz and that I had the ambition to further my career as such in that field. And he said, "Have you ever heard the TCU band?" And I said, "No, I have not." He says, "Well, today they're appearing on WBAP radio, and they're playing, I forget what college they were playing, and at halftime you'll get a chance to hear their jazz band, and I think you'll be impressed with it." Well, it just knocked me sky high, because when I heard it, it was something I wasn't expecting.
In 1938 and 1939, the TCU football team went on the road to Philadelphia to take on the Temple Owls, and the TCU marching band also made this trip.
Well, when they played a game in Philadelphia, and the band went on and performed at the half, and they just really played up a storm, and the people went playing jazz, yes. And the people went crazy in the audience, just went crazy. And when it was time for the teams to come back on the field, they began to boo. They weren't ready for it, and they raised such a ruckus about it. They got on the PA system and said, "Listen, we've just talked with the people with the TCU band, and if you'll sit back and relax the second half of the football game, the TCU band said that they will hang around after the game and play a short concert," which satisfied them. And I thought that was an unusual thing that happened to the band. When I got to TCU, one of the things that Don had told me, Don Gillis, he says, "You know, we do a lot of traveling." He says, "We were in Philadelphia last year, in New York, and well, my 4 years there, I think the farthest we went was to Houston, but that was all right."
The band program at TCU has had a long and illustrious history. And the introduction of jazz within the marching band was actually done by Don Gillis. And then it was taken over by Leon Breeden, and then Don's little brother, Lou Gillis.
Harvey Albert Anderson, yes. And let's not forget Tommy Gwynn.
Mm-hmm.
Tommy Gwynn was this outstanding drummer that went with Tommy Dorsey, took Buddy Rich's place, and stayed with Tommy for years. And you remember what we used to call him? Bludgeon Foot.
Bludgeon Foot.
Bludgeon Foot, because that time, once he started it didn't waver.
That was right there. That bass drum was right
and
there.
Harvey, bless his heart, we all miss him. I mean, all of his dear friends here, because he always had a funny quip for us.
But we do have a lot of his memories and his music at TCU because of the generosity of Bob Wright.
Yes, you betcha. And Bob worked for me, and when I think about it, for $17 big a night. And at that time, he was a student at TCU. His uncle was Uncle Pete Wright, that was a business manager, and Lord knows what TCU would have done without him. What a great man, and dedicated his life to TCU. And I'd pick up Bob, and take him, and bring him back home. And Bob was very dependable. You always knew he was going to be there on time, and you always knew he was going to play his part well with enthusiasm. When he was working and going to school, he showed an interest for medical related. He stayed in that and has made a reputation that's known internationally. He is one of the foremost in his field.
And he is responsible for Medical Cities.
Oh, Medical Cities, he's responsible for it, and I just can't say enough for him. And he loves TCU, and he's done so much for TCU. And he hasn't forgotten his friends that he met when he was playing for $17.
He started as a tenor saxophone player.
Yes, he did.
$17 a night.
Yep, he sure did. Jack Purvis is a big question mark because of the notoriety of the guy. Curtis, he was an outstanding virtuoso trumpet player, probably one of the best that has ever been around. But he was incarcerated in Huntsville for rolling a guy. I was familiar with some of his recordings going back to the late 20s and early 30s.
And he's from maybe Fort Worth?
No, I don't know where he was from. He spent most of his time in the East, and he was with some of the better bands of the 29 and 30 area. And there used to be the staff band at the WBAP would do a series of concerts down at Huntsville called Behind the Wall. And the warden had told him when the group went down from Fort Worth that there was a young man there that was one of the prisoners that they thought had outstanding talent, and he wanted them to hear him play. And Woods Moore told me that when they heard the guy play, they just couldn't believe it. To such an extent, they came back and they talked to some executives with the Star Telegram and some key people here and talked them into exerting some effort to get him out and get a pardon for him. And then they enrolled him at TCU. And then he played out at the Casa the year after the 36 when they had jumbo and different ones. And it was just amazing.
Billy Rose.
Yes. And he stayed at TCU probably at least a year, and during the night something motivated him just get up and slip away, and nothing is heard of him anymore. It's a big question mark, but he was at TCU and an outstanding trumpet player.
And you say there are historical recordings of him that do exist.
Yes. They're all collector's pieces now. Of him.
You said he played with Hal Kemp's band.
Hal Kemp was one of them, and just one of many. But back in those years, you just had a handful of guys that were well known. I mean, as a lead trumpet player or as a jazz trumpet player, he did both. I mean, he not only played a fantastic lead, but he also played jazz. He also played symphony. Mm-hmm. You just name it. Very well schooled.
The various nightclubs and gambling houses along Jacksboro Highway had a notorious reputation, but many of these establishments were also home to some great music.
Wood Seymour, when I came to Fort Worth, was head of the Musicians Union. And he also had the first real good big band at Lake Worth Casino, and it stayed there during the war. And I played there. We had worked 7 nights a week plus Sundays session, matinee session. So, and then I had an 8 o'clock at TCU every day. So it got to be pretty hairy there.
You had an 8 o'clock a.m.
Yeah,
class every morning. Yeah,
and
okay.
but I was delighted to have it because the money, it came in handy. And I met a lot of friends playing out there. Still see them. Saw a few last night at a party where we're reminiscing about the old casino days. Woods
owned Alt Music Company.
He bought the Alt Music Company from Klein Alt, and from that he bought Rhythm Band and began to make preschool instruments and became a multimillionaire. He was always good for a fast loan, by the way.
Bill White played at the Skyliner for years and years.
Yes, she was there, and let's see, Art Davis was there for a while. Bill White was another character that we loved.
Another TCU person. I think he finished everything but his senior recital at TCU.
I didn't know that.
He didn't play his senior clarinet recital, but did everything else.
From Weatherford, Texas.
Weatherford, Texas, and a very good friend of Jim Wright.
Very much. He certainly was.
Did you play the casino ballroom frequently?
Oh, all the time, yeah. I probably played about as much as any. When I first started there, the orchestra was, and you have to remember, it was almost the same group, just somebody else in front. The very first time was George McCullough had it, an alto player that was played an awful lot of saxophone. And then Charlie Alexander fronted it for a while. And then Woods took over.
Woods Moore.
And when he took over, Woods actually, even when George was there, was the main force behind it. But Woods stayed with it till they signed off. The casino was on Lake Worth, a beautiful lake. And if you remember the casino, you had the veranda open out there where you could see the lake. One Sunday, a storm blew up down on the coast, and they had all the PBY planes flown up for the north to try to escape.
Yeah. Get out of the storm.
Yes, and they landed on the lake right next to the casino, and it was darker and pitch, see. And the planes were stacked just wing to wing to wing to wing. And I happened to be out on the veranda there, and I could hear this little fisher boat putting buck coming underneath the bridge. He'd been fishing all day. In the meantime, they've landed all these planes, and he's going open throttle. He's wanting to get to the house. And I heard that, bam, bam. And then, what the hell is going on here? He kept running into those planes parked out there in the middle of the lake. Floor manager of the casino came up to me one night, and he says, would you make this announcement? And I read it, and it says, well, a person with the automobile, 1957 Chevrolet sports coupe with license number so-and-so, please go to the main office. No response. The guy comes back again within 30, 40 minutes. Well, the person, the same message. This happens about 3 times. The 4th time, the guy comes by, and he gets up to make the message. He's kind of disgusted because of no response. He says, well, the person was such. The reason we're trying to get in touch with you is your car is in the lake. And it was Jim Eckers. And it was a brand new car, and
Jim Merker is a jazz pianist.
Yeah, a very good piano player. And he'd pulled it around to the back and left it up kind of on the cliff and did not put it in gear. And then it rolled down, and then it wasn't ruined, but it was very close to it. And he jumped, he says, "That's my car!"
That's my car you're talking about.
Yeah. Great days, those were great days. And I'm just so delighted that they came along at a time that I could be, a part of it. It's something that I dreamed of doing from the time I was a kid.
Immediately after his graduation from TCU, Curly began his on-the-road musical experience by heading out to California during World War II.
My wife got my degree in absentia. I was already married. I married in 43, and I had an opportunity to join this band in Hollywood, but they could only wait to a certain time. And so I had to talk to the dean and all, and they were so nice and gracious. She said, "Well, we'll give you a little extra work and let you do your final paperwork for it." And I did, and with that I hopped a plane and went out and joined Frankie Masters' Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum's place in Hollywood, and that was the beginning of my tenure of being on the road. When I went out to California, and I worked with the Stooges for a long time, and they were the nicest, funniest guys. At Slapsy Maxie's, that was the key act that was
Slapsy
there.
Maxie.
Yeah.
That was the name of the club?
Yes. Slapsy Maxie Rosenblum, who was a movie star and also an ex-heavyweight fighter that didn't quite make the grade. And
what other comedians did you work for? Did you play acts? Did you play while you were performing?
Oh gosh, Hope,
Bob
Skelton, Eddie Cantor, it just on and on. And the first thing we did when I got there, the first thing we did was a concert at the Stage Door Canteen. Mm-hmm. And I was just totally in awe with it, because I was right out of this little small town. The MGM Orchestra was on when we got there, was already there. After we got through, I was standing out in the audience, and Catherine Grayson was going on to sing an aria from something, I forget what it was. But I'm aware of this girl in front of me with the prettiest red hair I ever saw. Gosh, and I was just in awe. And I noticed she had come with Grayson, and it ended up being Maureen O'Hara. Oh. And I'm telling you, that was the prettiest girl I ever saw. So, well, what does it look after 70 years? Well, she's the most beautiful old woman I ever saw.
Well, now speaking of female musicians, even from this area, a famous big band singer was Louise Tobin.
Oh, sure, married to Harry James, and
who is from Beaumont, Texas, originally.
Yeah.
And Harry James Jr. lives in Dallas.
And Louise has moved in with when they fixed the place.
Can you talk just a little bit about Louise? We, of course, we knew her second husband,
Peanuts
Hucko.
Yeah. She told me when she first met Harry was playing with Ligon Smith in Dallas. And she was 15, about to turn 16, and singing with them. And her mother made her go with some responsive person to a job because he was so young. And this happened, carried over till she also went to New York, and about that time she and Harry married, and it was Harry's early days with Benny Goodman.
Well, she sang with Benny Goodman's band.
Yes, she was, and I have a picture at home of her when she was still a young vocalist, cutest little old thing. And Harry, I guess it was in Chicago where he had a chance to, I think it was, to go with Goodman, and he just pulled out and left her in the hotel, and it was shortly after that it was obvious that their marriage wouldn't. But Peanuts, then she married Peanuts Hucko, a good friend of yours and mine, made her a great husband. He just depended on her for everything.
And he played, of course, he was
with the best band. Just outstanding clarinet. And Harry Jr. told me, and he told a whole bunch at Peanuts, it was his 73rd birthday in Denton, that he says, Peanuts is the greatest dad I ever had. Which pleased him, and I'm sure that that's true.
Many musicians during this era had colorful nicknames. Let's find out how and why Linwood Broyles got his.
Well, I'll tell you how that happened. We lived on a farm in Goliad, and we had a real nice Mexican fellow by the name of Thomas Quintero that ran it for my dad. And I can see him now, and he wore leggings, and he was just the nicest guy in the world. And he would call me Curly Top. And I could see him now after we moved back into town, and he'd come in on Saturdays. He'd come by to see me, he'd run his hand through my hair, and he said, Curly Top. And Curly just got started, and he started it. And you know, when I was in TCU, I had a professor by the name of Artemisia Bryson, and I always sat next to the door always. And when I got ready to leave, she'd always say, Mr. Broyles, would you cut off the lights? It was always strange because there'd been another class starting right away, and they'd have to cut it on. So she comes up to me and she says, don't you think the name Curly is a wee bit adolescent? And it kind of caught me off. And of course, wanting to make a good grade, I put on and said, well, I never thought about it, but you're absolutely right. Yes, it is. It's very adolescent. She said, well, don't you have another name other than Curly? And I says, yes. And she says, well, in heaven's name, what is it? And I said, Linwood. She says, Curly, cut the lights off on the way.
Curly will do.
Yeah.
I have a funny story to tell about you and two other trumpet players. Speaking of your name, Curly, this is a true story that had to be 32 or 33 years ago. Curly Broyles was playing in a church service at University Christian Church on an Easter, I believe, and they used brass, and there were 3 trumpets performing. Curly Broyles was one of the trumpets. The other trumpet player was Mo Trout, and the other trumpet player was Larry Harrison. And the minister got up to preach and looked at the program and said, this is the first time I've employed the Three Stooges in my sermon. Larry, Mo, and Curly.
I remember that.
True story, yeah. University Christian Church.
Yeah, I guess.
Curly played with numerous great big bands of this era.
Ray Baduke I went with in 45, and Ray had a little something about him very quickly, a terrific guy.
And a great drummer.
Oh, great drummer, a Dixieland drummer, and he had his greatest reputation he got with the Bob Crosby and the Bobcats. But he had been with the Dorsey Brothers and the Canaries and way back in the early 30s, and along with a lot of other musicians that became very prominent and leaders. I stayed with Ray about a year, and then the war came to an end, and Bob Crosby was getting out of the service, and he came and then took over that band, and it was run and managed by Gil Roden that you and I had talked quite about, and it was all ready for him to come in and just, but Duke really never wanted to front a band, and he was a terrific guy and a great drummer.
Well, speaking of drummers, what about Ray McKinley? And he's a Fort Worth connection there.
Yes.
If you speak some about Ray.
Yeah, McKinley came from Fort Worth, left here when he's probably about 15 years old.
And his father was?
As I recall, a county clerk here, Ray Sr., fine old gentleman. And I had met Ray at the casino one night, and we became friends, kind of hit it off. And when he organized his band, as you know, during the war, when
now he played with Glenn Miller's.
Well, he and Glenn had played together on several bands years ago, and were good friends. And when the war came, he went with Glenn, and McKinley was his drummer. And when he was killed, McKinley took over
Glenn Miller's band.
The Glenn Miller Band, and kept it till the end of the war. And as you know, at some time after, he fronted the what they call the Glenn Miller Band with Ray McKinley. There were several leaders to do that during the period.
Tex Biddicky being one.
Tex did it. Buddy DeFranco.
Now, Tex Biddicky is also a native of Fort Worth. So that's...
At one time, Glenn had three guys, I guess, from Fort Worth with him. Clyde Hurley was an excellent trumpet player, and he was raised out on the south side. He joined Glenn early band in the mid-30s. From Glenn's band, he went to Tommy Darcy's band. And from there, he went to Hollywood and went to work on the staff with MGM and their MGM, just a great orchestra out there, and remained till his health, and he finally passed away. And his father, whom he looked exactly like, lived out right across the street from Channel 5 that I got to know quite well.
WBAP was a big-time player in radio in North Texas, and in the late 1940s, the station expanded into television.
In August of '47, and I heard that the Star Telegram and WBAP radio were going to get into the TV business. And while I was a student at TCU, I was on their staff, their musical staff, and enjoyed it very much. Did 4 programs a week. And so it was just natural that I'd like to get on with somebody that I knew and with old friends. So I went out and talked to the manager and told him that I sure would like to get into TV. And fortunately, they put me to work, and I stayed 30 years and loved every minute of it.
30 years at WBAP?
Yeah.
Now, you did have a short tenure as a band director at Poly High School.
Yes, I did. That was in part of 47 and 48, basically 48, for 1 year. The leader there had been moved up to over all of the bands in Fort Worth, at Paris Sandifer, and he asked me if I'd take it over so he could devote more time to his job. And I was a little resistant at the time because I wasn't sure whether I was ready to do that job. But I did take it, and I will say this, it was an experience that I enjoyed because it was with youngsters, and the enthusiasm that they had kind of helped me, motivated me.
And why don't you talk about maybe your association with Jack Teagarden?
I first met Jack out in California, where the old Brevoort, where we were staying at the hotel. At the time, the band business was not what it's supposed to be, and Jack's guys were staying there, as well as Lawrence Welk's guys, and we were all kind of starving to get.
Jack Teagarden was
from Vernon, Texas. Vernon, Texas, yes. And I met him there. We didn't really become that close until much later. When I worked at WBAP, I really wore 2 hats. I still stayed a little active in the music business with my big band and Dixieland band until the last 10 years I was there, and the tail was wagging the dog, and I finally had to give it up. But
you also had a famous educator as a clarinet player in that band.
You
the
bet.
person that helped raise the University of North Texas.
Leon Breeden, you betcha. He was with us the whole 19 weeks. And during that time, that 19 weeks, we were allowed to bring in a guest from time to time. And the first person we brought in was Carol, I can't think of her name, the big blonde from Lawrence Welk Show. And then the second one was Jack Teagarden, and we flew him in. And I never will forget, this lady was waiting all day long for him to show up at the studio. And when he walked in, she ran up to him and says, "Hello, Weldon." And he just almost panicked. He says, "Weldon, I haven't been called that name in 60 years. She says, "Well, I used to be your sweetheart in Vernon, Texas." But with that, he finished, went to Houston, finished 2 days, went to New Orleans to play. The fourth day he was down there, had a heart attack, and died. And before he died, he called me from New Orleans and asked me if I would work 3 or 4 days that Goldie, who was his trumpet player, was going to have some dental work done, and I would have loved to have done it, Curtis. But by then I had become sales manager of the station, and it was just one of those things that you couldn't just take off and go down to play a gig, so to speak, although I would like to have done it.
This area is rich with music history of all kinds of music, and especially jazz and big bands and et cetera. And you and I were going through the archives here at the Fort Worth Public Library and found some interesting pictures, and maybe we could look at some of those, and maybe it'll take us down some roads down memory lane.
Fine.
Here is a picture of Denny Beckner.
Yes.
And you and I identified some of the members of that band.
Yes.
I noticed on trombone is Osborne Duke, Dr. Osborne Duke.
Old Oz.
Who was an English professor at TCU.
Yes.
And wrote one of the very first books, novels, fiction novels on jazz called Sideman.
Yes, and that's Harold Tomlin right there by your thumb.
Harold Tomlin on tenor saxophone.
Yes. And do you remember the slogan that he went by, Denny Beckner?
No.
The Pride of Comfort.
The Pride of
Comfort, Texas.
Comfort,
yes,
Texas.
Yes.
In this picture with the Denny Beckner Orchestra, by the way, these photographs come from the archives of the old Rocket Club on Jacksboro Highway. So we identified Ken Fowler,
yes,
who later became the
president of our union,
of the union, and we think perhaps that's Art Davis.
I think so. I think that was Art Davis, but Johnny Scatt's brother.
Johnny Scatt Davis of Fred Waring fame.
Yes, that's right. And Brother Rat, the movie with Ronald Reagan, they were good friends. And matter of fact, it was through that association that we were asked Scatt was asked to go play for Reagan's inaugural, and I happened to be asked in the group.
Played that, right?
Yes, and it was quite an occasion, and I was happy for Scatt that the president remembered him.
And it was good for you because you got to play the inaugural ball?
Yeah, that was held in the Smithsonian, and I'm a nut for that history anyway.
Well, I think we've all worked with this band leader before, Sandy Sandifer.
Sandy, you betcha. Milner is his real name.
I think he probably employed more young musicians that were college age, working our way through college than any other musician in this area.
He did for a fact.
And his brother is Perry Sandifer.
Perry, who is...
Now, Perry's still alive and is 100, right?
He's right around 100.
100 years old.
I've been trying to catch him for about a week, and he's hard to catch.
He keeps outrunning you, does he?
He does for a fact.
This is a picture of Sandy's wife, Betsy.
Betsy, yeah, pretty blonde.
And she sang with the band.
Yes, she did.
Yeah.
And I forget his years at TWC, but he had a group back there then, and that's before Leon and Ted Norman transferred.
Leon Breeden.
Yeah,
to TCU.
To TCU. So that would have been the 39. No, he was going.
Here's another band leader and saxophone player going way back. His son was at TCU with me, actually, Horace Puckett.
Remember Horace very, very well. A nice was a nice guy.
Now I think we've come to someone you know very well, Bobby Peters.
Yeah,
Band leader, comedian, and television star.
Bobby Peters had a show out at Channel 5, and he refers to it in his band at the club, which was the 400 Club. It had been the Ringside Club, but they called it, and his Maniacs. They did a skit in there, and I had my first group at his club. And we had this.
The 400?
Yeah, the 400 Club. Yeah. And this one number was around a song, and we did it as around.
Like Row, Row, Row Your Boat.
Yeah. But we would break up, and the 3 or 4 weeks we were there, we never got through it without breaking up on the floor, just rolling, laughing. We never finished it.
So you never heard the ending?
Never got it finished.
Well, now Bobby Peters had a Saturday morning television show for kids.
Yes, for kids. Very well liked for kids. And the reason why he didn't talk down to them, he talked to them like they were adults.
Now, did you recognize some of the players in this? You said that was Snuffy Klaus on trumpet?
Snuffy Klaus, Alan Borgfeld Klaus.
On trumpet.
Yeah.
And the saxophone player?
Is
Alexander?
Charlie Alexander. And and that was Cliff Ramey on bass.
When you were leading a band, you had a dance band, about a 15, 16-piece dance band. And I guess you played all the country clubs around here and private parties.
Fortunately so, yeah.
And then your Dixieland band, did it?
We did special things where they need Dixieland band, and we did the 19 weeks on TV for RCA Victor. That's when we invited named guests like Teagarden. And that was a lot of fun. And Ainsworth was also on that, by the way.
Billy Ainsworth, graduate of Pascal High School.
Yeah, Pascal High.
Went to Rice University as an engineering major.
Yes.
And then didn't finish Rice.
High intelligent. Yeah, worked with Peck Kelly all the time. He was in Houston, who was world famous.
Bob Bright set up the Harvey Anderson Jazz Scholarships, making it possible for young people to come to TCU. And another trumpet player from the TCU band that graduated about the same time, Charles Hoffman.
Charlie was, I think he was in my class.
I believe he was, 44,
yeah.
94.
I think he was.
Later on was band director of Carter Riverside for many, many years. He's conductor. I think he's still the conductor of the Fort Worth Shrine Band.
Well, I want to say this. I certainly don't intend this to embarrass you, but knowing you since you were about that high and being so fond of your dear sister, which was in my class at TCU, I can't say enough about what you've done for the jazz program there. And I don't know of anyone more prouder than me of you for the hard work and the fantastic results that you've shown. The school is just very, very fortunate to have you, Curtis.
Now, so you have to say that because I'm interviewing you.
Well, you said you wouldn't take me back home if I didn't just say that.
Thank you, Curly Broyles.
All right.
Thank you for watching Jazz Perspectives. I'm Kurt Wilson. Please join us next time as we explore another facet of jazz in Fort Worth.
The program you have just seen is now available on VHS or DVD. To purchase your own copy, please send $20 check or money order to CCT, 401 West 2nd Street, Fort Worth, Texas 76102. Please allow 4 to 6 weeks for delivery. You are watching Community Cable Television, tuned in to Fort Worth, a most livable community.